Welcome, and thanks for coming to my presentation, Indie Creatorship, Rendering the Indie-ness of Indie Games. My name is Christian Hayes, and I'm a PhD student at Deakin University, here to talk about rendering the indie-ness of non-traditional games. Non-traditional or indie video games represent an idiosyncratic form of video games that embodies a variety of diverse and nuanced mechanics, narratives, and themes. Current conceptualizations of such games adopt highly specific perspectives, and as a result may struggle to offer a holistic rendering of the disparate nature of indie games, instead exploring the game's unique features from within specific chosen contexts. For example, Nadav Lipkin discusses the politics of indie game production and conceives indie games in terms of their methods of distribution, tools of development, and an idiosyncratic subculture. Mikhail Feodotow, on the other hand, defines indie games in terms of a relationship between reduced commercial influence and more personal narrative content, positing that such games provide more direct insight into their authors' and communities' tastes, beliefs, and values. Conversely, Andrew Bailey problematizes the indie game subgenres of art games and walking simulators, contending that such terms are often applied to games that do not connect easily with ludic definitions based in much longer histories of games. Each of these explorations adopts a specific approach to examining the indie aspect of indie games, and as a result do not offer generalized or holistic renderings of what makes them indie. Despite their varied nature, these perspectives are not mutually exclusive, and if combined may help build a more nuanced understanding of the non-traditional video game form. In order to offer a potential bridge between different perspectives, my research proposes the concept of indie creatorship, a holistic exploration of the range of nuanced relations, interactions, and structures that construct the indie-ness of indie video games. Indie creatorship shares Aubrey Annabel's assertion that video games are a form of relation, composed of both video game elements and various wider ideas and cultural meanings. The concept of indie creatorship explores the construction of such processes of relation specific to the context of indie games. Indie creatorship renders this process as a co-creative act, as it is co-authored by both player and system. This concept consequently engages with a range of video game features, including game mechanics and narrative features, through to the game's social or wider context. In order to facilitate this multifaceted exploration, indie creatorship draws upon various fields of research. For example, aspects of Carolyn Winter's authorship as assemblage are integrated with Kaufman and Beghetto's 4 C's of creativity, while Alan Dix's principles of designing for appropriation are utilized to explore emergent game activity. Indie creatorship will contain 4 principles that seek to develop a holistic rendering of indie video games by exploring their mechanics, narrative content, and how players interact with them. The first principle asserts that indie creatorship involves a process of meaning making by the player as they assemble meaning from various resources. This process then mediates a player experience of and relation to a given game. The second principle renders indie creatorship as spatial, as a player's organisation and navigation of game structures, roles, and outcomes will affect how they relate to a game. The third principle proposes that indie creatorship is an active collaboration between player and system, destabilizing boundaries between player, designer, and game features. The final principle posits that indie creatorship is socially connected, and explores how games represent and reflect wider contexts, allowing players to explore and communicate relations to wider ideas. These principles will be evaluated through a survey that will seek responses from indie game players, designers, and researchers, exploring their perception of 5 indie video games. This will serve to validate the applicability of indie creatorship in use cases by applying the principles to existing indie games. Indie creatorship will also be applied and tested in a use case as part of my own practice-led research, as the concept will be used to inform the design and development of an indie game that forms a creative component of my PhD project. Indie creatorship provides potential for a holistic rendering of the process of engaging with indie games while simultaneously reflecting on their idiosyncratic nature as distinct from more traditional forms of games. In the context of increasing emphasis on greater diversity in game material, indie creatorship provides potential for nuanced conceptualization of indie games and their content. Despite this, the multifaceted approach maintains flexibility, providing scope for adjusting to advancements in indie games. Thanks for listening. If you're curious or want to find out more, you're more than welcome to contact me using the email on screen.